Your hand is gripping a heavy box, fingers pressed against the cardboard, and you feel it start to slip. You squeeze harder, not because you decided to, but because something in your hand already knows what will happen if you don't. That squeeze is a negotiation with a force you cannot see or touch directly and have never once had to study to use perfectly every day of your life. The same force in your fingertips is what lets a car the size of a small room respond to the push of a pedal. It is what lets a rope thinner than your wrist hold back a boat weighing tons, and what stops a loaded truck from sliding through a red light. How does something invisible do all of that? How does it let something as small as a hand or a foot control something so much bigger than itself? Let's get into it right here on Small Things. Stuck, then suddenly easy. Stand a heavy filing cabinet on a tiled floor and push it sideways with one foot. The first push barely moves it. Push harder, and for a moment nothing happens, as if the cabinet has decided to stay put. Then, all at once it gives, and the strange part is what happens next. It now takes noticeably less effort to keep it sliding than it took to start. That difference between stuck and sliding is friction changing shape. While the cabinet refuses to move, an invisible force matches your push, holding it in place. The moment your push wins, that force is still there, just weaker, dragging against the motion rather than preventing it. Engineers call these two states static and kinetic, but you knew the feeling before you knew the words. A mountain range you cannot see. Run your hand across a polished tabletop and it feels perfectly smooth. It is not. Zoom in far enough on almost any surface, and what looks flat reveals itself as a landscape of microscopic peaks and valleys. Even the most carefully machined steel, the most polished glass, is covered in tiny ridges too small for your eye or fingertip to detect. This jagged, invisible terrain is the real surface of everything you touch, hiding in plain sight under every surface that looks completely flat. When two surfaces come together, they do not meet edge to edge across their full width the way they appear to. They meet peak to peak at a scattering of tiny high points, while the valleys between them stay open and untouched. Only a small fraction of what looks like solid contact is actually touching at all. Those few points of real contact carry the entire weight pressing down on them, so the pressure right at each peak is enormous, far higher than the average pressure spread across the whole visible surface. For the surfaces to slide past each other, every one of those tiny peaks has to be forced to deform, crumple, or shear off, one microscopic collision at a time, multiplied across millions of points at once. That resistance, accumulated across an invisible mountain range nobody ever sees, is where the dragging feeling in your hand actually comes from. There is a second, stranger layer underneath it. At the very closest points of contact, atoms from one surface can briefly bond with atoms from the other, like a momentary handshake at the molecular level. Sliding means breaking every one of those tiny handshakes, one by one, all at once. Leave two surfaces resting together, and more of these bonds quietly form over time, which is part of why a box that has been sitting still for a while can feel harder to start moving than one that has only just stopped sliding a moment earlier. This is the part most people never picture when they imagine friction. There is no neat coating of resistance smeared across a surface. There is only an uncountable number of tiny individual collisions and bonds, happening everywhere two things touch, every time anything moves against anything else. The smoother an object looks, the easier it is to forget this invisible landscape is there at all, working beneath the surface you can actually see. Press harder, grip harder, place an empty box on the floor and push it. Now load it with bricks and push again. The second push takes far more effort, and it has nothing to do with the box itself changing shape or material. The harder two surfaces are pressed together, the more those microscopic peaks dig into each other, and the more friction resists motion. This pressing together force is called the normal force, and for something simply sitting on a flat floor, it is just the object's weight, pushing down, matched by the floor pushing back up with equal force. Add bricks, increase the weight, increase the normal force, and the peaks on both surfaces are squeezed together that much harder, with nowhere to escape that pressure. This single idea explains far more than it first seems to. On a ramp, tilt the surface and part of that pressing force angles away instead of pushing straight down, which is why the same object grows easier and easier to slide as a slope gets steeper. Tilt it far enough, and the pressing force drops so low that almost nothing is left to hold the object in place at all. In a bolted joint, the pressing force does not come from gravity, but from the bolt itself, tightened until it clamps two parts together with tremendous force, locking them against sliding, even though nothing is actually welded or fused. In a brake system, a caliper squeezes two pads against a spinning disc from either side, and the harder it squeezes, the harder those surfaces grip, and the faster the spinning disc is forced to slow down and stop. Every one of these, a stack of bricks, a steep ramp, a tightened bolt, a clamped brake pad, is the exact same idea wearing a different costume. Press harder, and the invisible grip underneath gets stronger. It is the simplest lever an engineer has, and one of the most reliable, because it requires no special material, no clever trick, nothing beyond squeezing two surfaces together, a little harder than before. Bigger does not mean grippier. Picture two blocks of identical weight, one with a small square base and one with a wide flat base spread out over far more floor. Most people assume the wide one will be harder to push because it looks like more surface is touching the ground. That assumption is wrong, and the reason reveals something genuinely strange about how grip actually works. The two blocks, despite looking completely different, take almost exactly the same force to start sliding. The explanation goes back to those microscopic peaks, spread the same weight across a wider base, and the pressing force at each individual contact point actually drops, because that same weight is now divided among more peaks. Fewer of them get squeezed hard enough to properly interlock or form those fleeting molecular handshakes. The visible area looks larger, but the real area of true contact, peak to peak, barely changes at all. A wide block and a narrow block of the same weight grip the floor with almost identical force, because grip was never really about how big the contact looks. It was always about how hard the real contact points are pressed. There is one notable exception. Very soft materials, like rubber, behave differently because they flex and mold themselves around a surface rather than meeting it only at rigid peaks. This is exactly why a wider, softer tire genuinely does grip the road better than a narrow one, a detail that matters more than it might seem. The grip that steers a car. A car does not move because its engine spins the wheels. It moves because the tires grip the road, and that grip is the only thing turning rotation into motion at all. When a tire is rolling normally, each patch of rubber touches the road, presses down, and lifts away again without ever sliding against the surface. The same press harder, grip harder rule from earlier quietly doing its job underneath every ordinary drive. Push the accelerator, and the wheel tries to spin faster than the car is actually traveling. For an instant, the bottom of the tire tries to slip backward against the road, and friction resists that slip, pulling the car forward instead. Brake hard and the opposite happens. The wheel tries to slow faster than the car, the tire tries to slide forward, and friction pulls backward, slowing the whole vehicle down. This is grip doing the actual driving every single time you press a pedal. Push either pedal too hard, especially on a wet or icy road, and that grip can run out entirely. The tire stops rolling cleanly and starts sliding across the surface instead. The moment that happens, steering inputs barely matter anymore because a sliding tire grips far less than a rolling one, and a car that cannot grip the road cannot be controlled by the small movements of a steering wheel. The same invisible force that lets a foot command a 4-ton machine is the only thing standing between that control and a complete loss of it. One hand, three friends. There is an old trick sailors have used for centuries to hold back forces no human arm could manage alone. Wrap a rope a few times around a wooden post, wind it through about 2/3 of a turn, and a gentle 100-Newton pull can hold back roughly 3.5 times that much force. One more turn, and that same pull holds back well over 2,000 newtons. One hand, barely straining, comfortably holding the weight of 3 grown adults, purely because friction compounds with every wrap. That is the real shape of this force, and it was never really about slowing things down. It is what lets something small decide what something enormous is allowed to do. Every time a grip stands between control and chaos. Without it, almost everything would move more easily, and almost nothing could be controlled. If this changed the way you think about the next time your hand grips something heavy, let us know in the comments what you want us to explore next. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.